Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
You are listening to Mortification of Spin. My name is Todd Pruitt. I'm the pastor at Covenant Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Carl Trueman, who teaches at Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania. Now, we're doing something a little bit different here because Carl is not just the co-host, he is the guest today. Carl, how does it feel to be a guest on my podcast?
It's a great honor, man. As you know, I've been a listener to the podcast for many years, and to actually be the guest, it's a huge honor.
I can't imagine. Yeah, it would be neat.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the large guest fee that we routinely give to the guests who come on at the end.
That's right. Yes, when I write my book on the theology of Stryper, I will expect you to interview me for that.
We will. Stryper, as you know, they have a special place in my heart.
You love 1980s American contemporary Christian metal. I know that.
Yeah. You only have to look at my head to know that I'm a big hair rock guy, essentially.
Yeah. Well, Carl, you've gone and you've done it again. You've written another book. Not that you churn these things out. I mean, it's been like you worked on this one for a number of years. And if there's anyone in our audience that doesn't know it, Carl's book, his new book, which is brought to us by Broadman and Holman Publishers, the good Southern Baptist folks. And they had approached you several years back to see if you would consider writing sort of an introduction to critical theory. And that is what we have now from you. I just got mine about a week ago. It's entitled To Change All Worlds, Critical Theory from Marx to Marcuse. And Carl, I haven't completed it, but I'm close. And I'll cut through the tension and say I really enjoyed it. In fact, one of the things that was really interesting is I don't know if he listens to the podcast. If he does, I'll hear about this. But I have a friendly acquaintanceship with a university professor who is a committed Marxist. And we get along really well because we study in the same coffee shop. And so we have lots of friendly banter. We give each other a hard time. But this was sitting on my table just the other day, and he walked over and he was looking at it, and he said, well, now this could be really interesting. He said, you ought to let me read it and I'll review it for your podcast. And I told him, I don't know if we'll do that. But he's an interesting Marxist. And the reason I bring him up is because as I was reading certain passages in this, I knew that he would be able to say, yes, that describes what I believe. You know, I knew that there were extended places in this where he would have felt accurately represented. And that's one of the things I noticed about your book is you didn't set out to write a screed against critical race theory. And there are some good critiques of critical race theory out there. Your project was to write an early history of critical theory. Does that get at it pretty well?
Yes. I mean, I wanted to play to my strengths. I'm really a historian, an intellectual historian. That's somebody who studies ideas in their historical context. And I'm convinced that modern iterations of critical theory, that many of the principles that they represent or articulate are there right at the start of the critical theory movements in the early 20th century. And I thought it would be interesting to produce a book that was not a kind of goodies and baddies book. Okay, right. You know, everybody coming to critical theory has their opinion on whether the critical theorists are good guys or bad guys. I didn't really want to address that. What I wanted to do was look at critical theory through the historical lens and say, okay, why did this group of men start to think in this way? What's going on? What sources are they using? What problems are they trying to address? What questions are they asking? In order to dig below the surface and get below the level, if you like, of tweets.
Right.
Critical theory is bad or critical theory is
Mm-hmm.
good. Get below the surface and say, okay, what are they trying to do?
Mm-hmm.
And then, only then, move to some kind of assessment about, okay, so are the questions they ask interesting? Are they appropriate? Are the answers they give appropriate or correct? So I wanted it to be a historical exposition. The brief from B&H was very much, we want a book that we can give to seminary students or college undergraduates in the sort of the Southern Baptist world, that won't give them a red meat or bomb throwing polemic, but will allow them, I suppose, if you like, to be able to read the sources and assess the sources for themselves. Critical theory is often very jargon laden. Many of the classic and important works are really very dense if you go in cold. So what I wanted to try to do with this book is provide a narrative history and then a study of key themes that would enable the reader to go off and do their own exploration within the primary texts of the approach.
And one of the things I noticed was that if you, first of all, you do offer, ultimately, you offer some good Christian critique near the end, which is very helpful. You didn't approach this as someone who has no opinion as to the value of critical theory, but it's clear you labored to fairly represent them. And one of the things I noticed was, if you simply go off of the most contemporary iterations of critical theory, like gender theory, critical race theory, that kind of thing, you can read some of the popularizers of those movements and probably have no idea what actually some of the early architects of critical theory were actually asking about or inquiring into. Yes?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I rather, I suppose, sort of somewhat facetiously cite Karl Marx near the beginning, because Marx has this comment on Hegel. He says that Hegel comments that all great personages in history occur twice.
Mm-hmm.
And Marx glosses that by saying, but he forgets to say the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce.
Mm-hmm.
And I play on that, say, critical theory is a bit like that, because, when we think of critical theory today, we're thinking of justifying drag queen story hour in elementary schools or something
Hence
like
the
that.
Farce.
Yeah, it's farcical in many ways. Mm-hmm. If you go back to the early critical theorists of the 20s and the 30s, they're wrestling with the rise of Nazism. Right. And many of them are Jewish. Mm-hmm. So this is not an
in Germany.
Yeah, in Germany. This is not an abstract question for them.
Right.
They want to know, why are the working classes supporting radical rightist anti-Semitic parties? What's going on here? Why hasn't Marx's theory of history, where the working class, crushed by capitalism, rise up and realize a communist utopia? Why isn't that happening? Why is it that the working class, if anything, seem to be coming, from a Marxist perspective, more reactionary? Why do they vote against their best interests? Why do they hate the Jews? Why has race rather than class come to grip their imaginations as that which divides or unifies?
Right.
So I wanted to, when B&H approached me, they gave me a general brief and said, we want a book on critical theory. And I said, well, I'll do it, but I will only do it on the earlier stuff.
Mm-hmm.
For a number of reasons. But one of them is I actually regard the earlier critical theorists as being serious players on two fronts. They're asking serious questions about a serious moment in history. And they're, generally speaking, very well versed in the Western philosophical tradition. These are very, some of them are quite evil. I mean, George Lukács I would regard as an evil man.
Right.
But a very sophisticated and very intelligent evil man, a brain worth engaging with, even though he's a rather despicable human being.
Right.
So I wanted to take the reader into what I regarded as the serious, substantial origins of critical theory, rather than dealing with the pop versions that sow such chaos in our contemporary world.
Yeah. And so among the questions they're asking questions about humanity, about why is it that people over periods of time and in different epochs start to relate to each other differently. And traditionally, maybe historically, the majority answer to those things would have been tied to the notion of human nature. And these guys come along and challenge that, which was a big thing to challenge at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're building very much against the background of the German philosopher Hegel, late 18th, early 19th century, and also against Karl Marx. I mean, we're dealing with the Frankfurt School critical theory. You're really dealing with guys operating from the 1920s through to the 1960s. That's the time period I sort of look at.
Yeah.
But what they're picking up from people like Hegel, and even more so from somebody like Marx, is that the question of what does it mean to be a human being, they don't think it's susceptible to a single answer. In other words, if you want to know what it means to be a human being, you've got to go to a particular time and a particular place and find out what it meant there and then. We might use an analogy. The analogy I use in the book is that of a marriage. If you were to say to a husband and wife, what does marriage mean? They'll probably give you a different answer on the day after their wedding to the one they'll give you on their 25th anniversary to the one they'll give you on their 50th anniversary. The definition of marriage kind of changes for them as they interact and relate with each other. And this is what critical theorists would call, a dialectical approach to things. And human nature has to be understood dialectically.
Kind of a conflict, right? Kind of a conflict.
Yeah. It has to be understood in the way that individuals relate to each other and to the wider context in the circumstances in which they find themselves. And of course, that plays into something like critical race theory, because one of the things you'll hear with critical race is say, well, your view of what it means to be human, that's a white view, that's whiteness,
right,
or that's driven by white privilege. That's resting on a similar idea. It's saying that actually, the idea you have of what it means to be human, the idea that you think is natural and applies in all times and all places, is actually very specifically constructed to do certain things only in the society in which you find yourself living.
Yeah. So as I was thinking through some of this, one of the questions that comes then is they would have, so critical theory in its genesis, is it possible to embrace their presuppositions and believe that God is?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think one has to be careful how you answer this question, because there's certainly a case for saying that some of the things that critical theorists say are true. I mean, I would want to say it is, the 4th century BC Athenian thinks and behaves very differently to the 16th century Saxon, Luther, very differently to the late 19th century German, very differently to the early 21st century American. There's a sense
history and culture make a difference.
Yeah, we want to say that culture plays a big role in how we think about the world, we think about ourselves, how we relate to other people. But you don't have to be a critical theorist to agree with that. I would say you just have to be a good historian, to get that. The thing about critical theorist is that the key is it's a line written by Karl Marx in a series of notes he makes on the German philosopher, a man called Ludwig Feuerbach, who's very influential, particularly Marx's view of religion. And this statement that Marx makes is actually engraved on the base of his tomb in Highgate Cemetery in London. And the statement, it runs something as follows. The philosophers have, up until now, only described the world. The point is to change it. And what Marx is saying there is, look at a philosopher like Feuerbach, and all philosophers before Feuerbach. What are they doing? They're describing the world. They're telling you why the world is the way it is. But Marx wants to draw a line under that and say, so what?
Right.
So what are you going to do with that, Feuerbach? Where are you going to go with that? And so what Marx wants is philosophy of, we might say, philosophy as we could say, praxis. What does that mean? Philosophy is that which revolutionarily changes the world.
Right.
So the purpose of critical theory is not to make, in some ways, the rather banal point that, hey, people change over time. It's what do you do with that?
Right.
What do you do with that? Well, the critical theorist uses that to destabilize the status quo in order to move history forward towards its consummation. Contemporary example, think of the 1619 project. A lot of conservative commentators made, I think, very legitimate historical criticisms of the 1619 project. It was not an historically sound analysis. The problem is, I think, for many, that actually misses the point of what the 1619 project is.
They didn't intend it to be that.
They didn't care.
They didn't care, right?
Historically true. Yeah. They wanted to destabilize the dominant 1776 narrative, because in destabilizing that narrative, they move things towards this more just American society that will exist in the future. So when you look at early critical theorists, I don't know, he describes himself as a critical theorist, but his influence on critical theory, this Hungarian George Lukács. When you look at George Lukács's notion of truth, Lukács says, most people think truth is, we would say, it's a correspondence theory of truth. The cat sat on the mat is true if there is a cat sitting on a mat. Well, Lukács would say, no, what is true is any statement that moves history forward. So there may be a cat on the mat, but if denying that the cat on the mat sends the household into chaos and precipitates revolution and pushes history forward, then the statement the cat is not on the mat, that's actually true, right, even though it's not referentially true, right, because it has the right, we might, for using sort of Christian language, it has the right eschatological impact.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we've seen your reference to the 1619 project is a perfect example of how philosophy moves from the classroom into the mainstream with enough passage of time. I remember, when those terrible events with Michael Brown happened in Ferguson, Missouri, which really kind of touched off a rise. Well, it touched off the Black Lives Matter movement, and when it came out, even under the Obama Justice Department, that some of the initial reports about what had happened weren't actually accurate. One of the things that we were being told was that doesn't matter.
Yeah.
In fact, the phrase "the facts aren't important here" was being repeated.
Yeah.
Well, none of those people have read Lukács.
No.
But his impact has been made.
Yeah, it's become part of the political intuitions of the day. And of course,
and the right does it as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's not a monopoly of the left. I've seen things recently where stories will come out and then they'll be shown to be exaggerated or twisted or even untrue. And even leading politicians on the right will say, well, it doesn't really matter because it got the discussion on the table.
Right.
And there's a sort of, okay, maybe my sympathies politically lie more with you, but we've got to be careful here.
Absolutely.
Particularly as Christians.
Absolutely.
Because as our Lord himself says, with the measure you measure it out, it's going to be measured back to you. And I don't want to play the critical theory game.
Right.
Even when it might suit my own political ambitions to do that.
Yeah.
Because at that point you are conceding, it's like blowing up the filibuster. It may benefit you today, but gosh, it could really come back and bite you on the backside tomorrow.
That's right. And you and I have talked a lot about the fact that it's disheartening when Christians and even pastors will advance. Well, they'll justify using deception. They'll justify being dishonest about things because the cause is righteous.
Yeah.
Well, in a sense, that's just critical theory, isn't it? Critical theory for conservatives.
Got to be very, very careful. Of course, the classic example is, the Nazis bang on the door and you've got Jews in the basement. What do you do?
Yeah.
I myself actually wouldn't have much of a problem there in telling a lie.
Of course.
Because it seems to me I'm faced with two options, neither of which is morally pure.
But
I
you're
got to go
preserving
for
life.
yeah. But most of the time in typical political parlance today, we're not facing quite that
That's
issue. Now,
right.
if we're honest, we're not facing
Right.
quite that issue.
Right. We are
So
not the
direct.
we're not the tin booms
Yeah.
hiding a vulnerable family in
Yeah.
our home from people who will murder them. That's
Yeah.
usually not what's at stake in our
Yeah. It's a
some of those kinds of
character,
things.
that what you're raising is a character issue. And,
Right.
in the Reformed tradition, the shorter and especially the larger catechism, very, very clear about how Christian character is to operate in all walks of life. You
Right.
can't just, I said recently on Kevin DeYoung's podcast, I made some comment, Christians shouldn't lie. And
Mm-hmm.
and there were all these people descending on me saying, oh, Trueman's talking politics. Well, actually, no, I wasn't making any statement about a policy at
Right.
all. What I was talking about was Christian character.
Yeah.
You can be a socialist, you can be a communist, you can be a capitalist.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what I'm talking about.
Right.
What I was talking about is how should we as Christians relate to whatever the issue that confronts us is. And critical theory really, in some ways, allows us to excuse what the Bible condemns as wicked behavior because the cause is right.
Right.
One could say, Aaron at the foot of Mount Sinai with the golden calf. Hey, he's keeping the people on board at that point. He's doing what he's got to do to keep the people on board while Moses is up the mountain. Well, that isn't God's judgment on what Aaron's doing. No,
exactly.
Aaron has broken the law, and man, there's going to be consequences for this. So,
right. Yeah. How did these early thinkers, how did their thought become what we see now with critical race theory, gender theory? I mean, for one thing, because of what was going on in Germany, the Frankfurt School literally up and moved to Columbia University.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, they're in the States now having a direct impact. In fact, wasn't it Marcuse who went on to teach Angela Davis? Wasn't she a student?
Yeah, she was a student of Marcuse.
Yeah.
Like a lot of these guys, they're very happy to be paid by the United States, even as they trample on everything the United States stands for.
Yeah. Where did they, so they owe some things to Marx and you can't get Marx without Hegel, but they also saw Marx's am I right in saying they saw Marx's project as too narrow?
Well, I think the issue there in some ways is a question of the development of Marx's own thought. The thought they particularly favored was the Marx of the 1840s, when he's more Hegelian and less strictly materialist.
Just the economy.
Yeah, it's the more, I would say, the Marx of ideological critique that they like. And this, of course, is why Lukács has to repudiate some of his earlier writings because Hungary is Stalinist, and Stalin doesn't. The early Marx is regarded as somewhat deviant compared to the later Marx by these guys. So the early Frankfurt School is really it's a kind of sometimes it's referred to as the humanist Marx, where Marx has perhaps a slightly stronger notion of what it means to be human being, a slightly stronger notion of human nature than the later Marx does. But it's really the early Marx they draw on. But they also draw on Friedrich Nietzsche. There are two other thinkers, I think, very important for the early Frankfurt School. One of them is Nietzsche. And what Nietzsche shares in common with the Frankfurt School is this. He sees human relations as relations of power and manipulation. And that's something that connects very easily to the kind of Marx that they're drawing from in the 1840s. And the other thinker is Freud, because there's a strong sexual critique, particularly with Marcuse, that one finds. In some ways, what religion was for Marx in the 19th century, the kind of the ideology that keeps everybody in place, sexual codes become for Marcuse in the 20th century. What's keeping society stable? It's these overly strict sexual codes. That's the ideological structure that needs to be overcome. So not just Marx, but also Nietzsche and also Freud. Three not immediately compatible thinkers. Nietzsche and Freud may be more compatible, but Marx and Freud not particularly compatible. But the Frankfurt School managed to draw all three.
Yeah. And so as we think about the questions they were asking and some of their observations, some of the questions they were asking were questions that a lot of people in their right mind, particularly if you're a Jew in Germany in the 1930s, you're going to ask. Some of their observations, people change, relationships change, the way we relate to, culture impacts that. Again, people have known that well before there were any critical theorists. So given that some of their observations can be chalked up, early observations, to what people have known for a long time, given that they asked some questions that most people would ask given the circumstances of the day, does that translate then into, therefore, there are things about critical theory that wed nicely with historic Christianity or with the gospel? In other words, can we take here are the good things that Christianity can take from critical theory, so long as we just discard this or that? And would the proponents of critical theory think that you could do that?
Well, the proponents of critical theory, by and large, would not think that you can do that.
Right.
You don't draw on Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud and have a very high view of God. So we can put that aside. I think the question here is, I would say it's one of the pedagogical use of language. That I heard it said a lot. Critical race theory is a useful tool. Well, I would press back on that on two fronts. I would say, one, first of all, when you abstract the things that you like about the descriptive parts of critical race theory. Okay, racism's a real thing. It manifests itself in certain ways. Brown v. Board of Education was not passed for entirely altruistic reasons.
Right.
When you pull those things out and affirm, you're not really affirming critical theory. You're doing what critical theorists would call traditional theory at that point. You're describing the way the world is, to take that first half of Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Secondly, I would say, use an analogy with heresy in the church. Think about Arianism in the 4th century. Arianism, well, it makes it raises the question of the distinction between father and son. It makes the point that you can't conflate the father and the son. Well, those are good things. But no way am I ever going to tell my students in class, Arianism is a really useful tool.
Right.
I'm going to say, when you approach Arianism, one thing to do is ask what legitimate question or what legitimate issue is Arianism raising? What is it demanding that I answer? But that's very different to saying Arianism's a useful tool.
Right.
I might go as far as to say Arianism is useful in raising the right question here, but it's still a heresy.
Yeah.
I still don't want you to think about it as useful in any way whatsoever. Oh, and by the way, it's only raising a question that if you read scripture, you'd come to anyway.
Yeah.
And down to things like when you think about one of the big things of critical theory is we tend to ascribe power to something that isn't real. So we'll talk about the economy. It's called reification. We'll make the economy a thing. Well, the economy isn't a thing. It's a term we use, but then takes on a life of its own so that we can lay off half our workforce because the economy demands it. I think it's good to realize that that's a problem. But I would say the Bible gives us that in Isaiah, for example, when the man, he chops the tree in half of it he cooks his dinner with, the other half he carves into a garden, he bows down and worships it. And he never asks himself, why is this consistent? Why do I do this? When Paul says in Romans 1, they suppress the truth in unrighteousness, they engage in idolatry. I think those questions that critical theory alerts us to, we can then easily find them in the Bible. They're there in the Bible already. So I am very opposed to the idea that critical theory is a useful tool, but that is not to say that critical theory is useless. Put it that way. It raises some interesting questions. It demands that I think more self-consciously about certain things that I might have forgotten about. But it does not provide me with a constructive way, a constructive lens to analyze the world.
Mm-hmm. And I would just say to our listeners, given that Christians ought to be thoughtful about the debates that we enter in on, in as much as we can avoid being an idiot, we ought to avoid that. And so therefore, if your knowledge of critical theory doesn't extend beyond Twitter, then maybe you ought to read a good, helpful introduction to it. And I really highly commend Carl's book. It's entitled To Change All Worlds. You're going to be seeing it. One of the things that I was impressed with is that it is not, you don't look at it and get scared. It's for the project that you undertook. It's fairly concise, which I one of the reasons I liked it was that I can tell the appeal and the helpfulness for this book will go way beyond just the graduate student. Those of you that know Carl, you know he's a good teacher. He teaches well in the written word also. And if you want to get a good overview, a good introduction to what critical theory is so that you can actually have intelligent conversations about it, this would be a great book for you. And let's face it, people are talking about critical theory. Who would have thought, Carl, that Southern Baptists and Presbyterians would be talking so much about what had been a rather obscure academic exercise from a small school in Germany in the 1930s. I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, just that alone is fascinating. Everybody now has an opinion on critical theory.
I thought it was passé in the early 90s. Right. Here you go.
Who would have thought? Who would have thought? So I would encourage you all to get this book. You'll enjoy reading it. It's very interesting. And by the end of it, if you read this, you'll at least have some thoughtful things to say. And Christians should be obligated to do that. When we describe someone's position, we ought to get it right. Even if we disagree with it, they ought to recognize their beliefs in the way that we describe their beliefs. And this book will go a long way in helping you do that on a subject that it seems like everyone is talking about, but a lot of people aren't talking about intelligently. So if you'll go to our website, mortificationofspin.org, you can enter to win a copy of this book. If you don't win it, then go to the place you like to get books and get a copy. You will appreciate it. You'll enjoy it. I hope you'll read it. And while you're at our website, if you'd like to make a donation to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can do that. And until then, we'll look forward to having you back with us here on Mortification of Spin.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.